The Eclipse cut through the water like a blade, its black sails catching the wind as it drifted into the open sea. From the shores of Lisbon, it had seemed a relic of a past age, a sailing vessel resurrected for one last voyage. Its wood was dark with age, the hull creaking under its own weight, yet it moved with an eerie smoothness, as though it had sailed these waters for centuries. The crew, a mix of seasoned sailors and eager first-timers, had no idea what awaited them beyond the horizon. Captain Elias Blackthorne stood at the helm, his weathered hands gripping the wheel with practiced ease. He was a man of few words, his face carved by time and hardship, but his eyes betrayed something more, an unease, as if he alone understood what they were sailing toward. The crew whispered about him in hushed tones, questioning why he had been chosen to lead a ship of such mystery. No one knew who had commissioned the voyage, only that their instructions were clear. Sail west, follow no maps, and ask no questions. Beneath deck, the ship's quarters were small but serviceable. The hammocks swayed with the ship's motion, their occupants murmuring quietly, still adjusting to the vastness of the sea. Among them was Julian Hayes, a young deckhand eager to prove himself, though the weight of uncertainty gnawed at him. His bunkmate, an older sailor named Rourke, laughed at his apprehension. "You'll get used to it, lad," he said, sharpening a knife against a whetstone. "First few nights are the hardest. Then the ocean gets inside you, and you start to feel like you've always belonged to it." Above, the night began to swallow the last traces of land. The lighthouse at Cabo de Roca blinked once, twice, and then was gone. It was a strange thing, Julian thought, to watch the world vanish behind him. He had expected to feel a sense of adventure, but instead, a cold unease settled in his gut. Something about the sea felt too empty. No birds followed them. No distant ships passed on the horizon. The Eclipse was alone. By midnight, the wind had shifted, carrying the scent of salt and something else, something damp, like old wood left too long in the rain. The rigging groaned, and the ship's lanterns flickered, as though the darkness itself had begun to press inward. The crew remained lively, sharing stories and passing around a bottle of rum, but their laughter was forced. Even Rourke, a man who had seen more storms than any of them, kept glancing at the water. The sea was calm, too calm. The waves did not rise or crash against the hull as they should have. The water stretched out smooth as glass, reflecting the ship in perfect clarity. Julian leaned over the railing and peered down, expecting to see his own reflection staring back at him. Instead, there was nothing, just blackness. From the crow's nest, the lookout, Tobias, suddenly called down. No stars. The crew fell silent. They turned their eyes upward and saw that he was right. The sky, once speckled with constellations, had gone completely dark. No moon, no stars, just an empty void. Captain Blackthorne remained unfazed. He stepped away from the wheel and moved to the ship's edge, gazing into the abyss above them. "Stay your course," he ordered. "No one stops working. No one panics." His voice was steady, but his knuckles were white against the railing. Then, from somewhere below deck, a sound echoed through the ship. It was faint at first, like a sigh carried on the wind. But then it grew, a deep, resonant hum, vibrating through the wooden planks. It came from the hull, from the ship itself, as though something beneath the surface had exhaled. Julian turned to Rourke, his pulse hammering. "Did you hear that?" Rourke's face had lost its color. He nodded, gripping his knife a little tighter. "Aye," he muttered, "and I've heard it before." The Eclipse sailed forward into the endless night, and somewhere in the depths below, something listened. The next morning, the sea remained unnaturally still. The Eclipse drifted forward, its sails full, yet the water beneath it was motionless. The usual rocking of the ship was absent, as if it sailed through air rather than water. The crew moved cautiously about their duties, their laughter from the previous night replaced by uneasy silence. No one mentioned the strange sound that had rumbled from the hull. No one spoke of the missing stars. Julian Hayes woke with a start, his skin clammy, his breath shallow. He wasn't sure what had jolted him awake, only that a lingering voice, soft and whispering, had echoed in his head. He sat up and looked around the dimly lit cabin. The other men still slept, their bodies swaying slightly in their hammocks, their faces twisted in uneasy dreams. He shook his head, trying to dismiss the lingering unease, and climbed out of his bunk. Above deck, the morning air was heavy, thick with the smell of salt and something else, something damp and ancient. Captain Blackthorne stood at the bow, staring ahead with an intensity that made Julian hesitate before approaching. The man had barely spoken since they'd left port, and his silence carried a weight that none of the crew dared question. "Sir," Julian finally said, his voice hesitant, "the men are feeling uneasy." He wanted to say afraid, but that word didn't seem quite right. Fear was something tangible, something caused by things seen and known. This was different. It was a feeling in their bones, a wrongness that none of them could name. Blackthorne didn't turn. "The sea is testing us," he said simply. "It watches before it acts." Julian frowned. "The sea?" At that, the captain finally looked at him, his eyes dark and unreadable. "Mind your work, Hayes, and listen carefully to what it tells you." Julian didn't ask what he meant. He wasn't sure he wanted to know. As the day stretched on, the tension among the crew thickened. Tobias, the lookout, swore he kept seeing something in the water, a shape that swam just beneath the surface, keeping pace with the ship. When pressed, he couldn't describe it, only that it wasn't a fish, wasn't a whale, wasn't anything that should be in these waters. The men dismissed it as shadows, tricks of the light, but no one could explain why the ocean remained so perfectly still. That evening, as Julian coiled rope near the stern, a voice reached his ears, a whisper, too faint to make out, like a breath against the wind. He froze, listening. The voice came again, slipping between the creaks of the ship, curling around him like mist. He wasn't alone. Turning sharply, he expected to see Rourke, Tobias, anyone, but the deck behind him was empty. The crew was gathered near the mast, eating their rations. No one was close enough to have spoken. Julian swallowed hard and took a step toward the railing, his pulse quickening. The whisper had come from the sea. He leaned over, staring into the black water, his breath catching in his throat. The ocean whispered back. It wasn't a single voice, but many. Dozens, maybe hundreds, all murmuring beneath the surface, speaking in a language he couldn't understand. The words overlapped, some too soft, others too sharp, forming an unnatural chorus that sent ice crawling up his spine. He stumbled backward, his heart pounding. "Captain," he shouted, his voice cutting through the night air. Blackthorne was already there, standing too close, his expression unreadable. "You heard it," he said. It wasn't a question. Julian nodded, his throat dry. "What is it?" Blackthorne exhaled slowly, his gaze drifting toward the sea. "The ones who sailed before us," he said. Julian's blood turned cold. "Before us?" The captain's face was unreadable in the dim lantern light, but his words were clear. "This ship has taken this course before, Hayes, and it always comes back." The sea whispered again, and this time, Julian could almost make out the words. The Eclipse sailed on, but to Julian, it no longer felt like a voyage. It felt like a trap. The ocean, dark and bottomless, stretched endlessly in all directions, a liquid void that swallowed the sky, the horizon, and perhaps even time itself. The ship moved forward, yet the world around them remained eerily unchanged, as if they were sailing in circles on an unseen thread of fate. The crew had stopped talking about the whispers, but their silence spoke louder than any words. Tobias, the lookout, no longer shouted reports from the crow's nest. Instead, he watched the waters with the wide-eyed terror of a man who had seen too much. Even Rourke, who had laughed off Julian's unease at the beginning, carried his knife at all times now, his fingers never far from the hilt. Julian found himself watching the water more often, dreading the moment he might see something looking back. He told himself the whispers were just the wind, that the strange stillness of the ocean was a trick of nature, but deep down, he knew better. Something was down there. Something was awake. Late into the night, as the crew lay in their bunks, the ship groaned. The sound was different from the usual creaks of old wood adjusting to the sea. It was deeper, more deliberate, like something pressing against the hull from beneath. The Eclipse shuddered, and for a brief, horrifying second, Julian swore he felt the ship rise, as if something massive had passed directly beneath it. A shout rang out from above deck. Julian leapt from his hammock, as did the others, scrambling for the ladders. When he emerged into the night air, he found the deck bathed in a sickly, greenish glow. The source was the ocean itself. The water no longer reflected the dark sky, but pulsed with a faint luminescence, a ghostly shimmer that stretched as far as the eye could see. The men gathered at the railing, whispering in hushed, frantic voices. "It's the Dead Man's Sea," someone muttered. Julian had heard of phosphorescent waters before, caused by bioluminescent plankton. But this was different. The glow was too uniform, too unnatural, as if the entire ocean had become a single, living thing. And then, the voices returned. Not whispers this time, but a low, rhythmic hum that vibrated in Julian's bones. The sound rose from the water itself, a steady, mournful song that ebbed and flowed like the tide. "What is that?" Tobias gasped. Captain Blackthorne stood at the bow, unmoving, his eyes locked on the horizon. "A warning," he said. The hum grew louder. Then, for the first time since they had set sail, the sea moved. The glassy surface rippled, and from the depths, dark shapes began to rise. At first, they looked like shadows, formless and shifting beneath the waves. But as they broke the surface, Julian realized with horror that they were human, or had been once. Pale, bloated figures drifted upright in the water, their empty eyes glowing with the same eerie light that filled the sea. One of the sailors screamed. The crew stumbled back from the railing, crossing themselves, muttering prayers. But the drowned things did not attack. They simply watched. Julian's breathing was shallow, his pulse thundering in his ears. "What do they want?" he whispered. Blackthorne's voice was grim. "They're waiting. For what?" The captain turned to him, his face unreadable. "For us to make a choice." The humming grew louder, and in the dark, Julian had the terrible feeling that something far larger was still lurking just beneath the surface, waiting for them to decide. The Eclipse drifted on the glowing sea, surrounded by the silent watchers. Their bloated faces were pale, their eyes too bright, their mouths slightly open as if waiting to speak, but no words came. The rhythmic hum that pulsed from the water had settled into an unbearable drone, one that Julian felt in his teeth, in his skull, in the pit of his stomach. The crew stood frozen on deck, every man gripped by a tension that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with inevitability. It was not a question of whether something was coming. It was a question of when. Rourke was the first to break. He turned sharply to the captain, his face contorted in anger, though Julian suspected it was mostly panic. "What the hell are they waiting for? Blackthorne?" His voice was strained, raw. "You said we had a choice." "What choice?" Blackthorne didn't look at him. He kept his gaze locked on the sea, his expression as unreadable as ever. "A sacrifice," he finally said. The word cut through the thick, humming air like a blade. The men shifted, exchanging wary glances. Julian's stomach twisted. "A sacrifice?" Tobias repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. "To them?" He gestured to the floating corpses, who continued their silent vigil in the water. Julian's mind raced. This wasn't the first time the Eclipse had taken this course. Blackthorne had all but admitted that before. How many times had this happened? How many men had been given to the sea? Rourke took a step forward, his hand on the hilt of his knife. "No," he said firmly. "We're not doing this. I don't know what game you're playing, Captain, but I won't." A sudden, sickening crack interrupted him. The ship lurched violently to one side, sending men stumbling. The sound hadn't come from the deck, nor from the sails. It had come from the hull. Julian scrambled to the railing, peering down into the water just in time to see something vast moving beneath the surface. The glowing sea distorted its shape, but he could make out writhing tendrils, too many to count, unfurling like the petals of a monstrous flower. The humming grew deafening. Blackthorne's voice was firm, though his face was pale. "If we don't choose, it will." The men recoiled as the realization sank in. The thing below wasn't asking for a sacrifice. It was demanding one. Another impact struck the hull, this time harder. The ship groaned, and the deck beneath their feet vibrated like a living thing. Julian felt the choice closing in around them like a tightening noose. It was either give the sea what it wanted, or all of them would be dragged beneath. Tobias, his face contorted with horror, turned to Blackthorn. "Who?" he asked. The captain didn't answer, but the answer didn't need to be spoken. A single thought now hung heavy in the air between them. Someone isn't making it out of this alive. The moment stretched unbearably, the glow of the water painting every terrified face in sickly green. No one moved. No one spoke. It was as if the air had thickened, trapping them in the inevitability of what was to come. Below the ship, the thing in the water pulsed, unseen but undeniable, a presence so vast and ancient that Julian could feel it pressing against the edges of his mind. Then, the ship lurched again, this time with such force that several men were thrown to the deck. The sound of splintering wood filled the air as something massive scraped along the underside of the hull. The creature was growing impatient. "We have to decide now," Blackthorn said, his voice cold and final. Rourke was the first to react. His blade flashed as he stepped forward, eyes scanning the crew. "We don't have to let it choose," he snarled. "We choose." Tobias stumbled back. "You're talking about murder." Rourke's expression was unreadable. "We're talking about survival." Julian felt something inside him break. This wasn't how it was supposed to happen. The sea had its dangers, yes, but it was storms and reefs, hunger and thirst, not this. Not monsters. Not sacrifices. Another blow slammed into the Eclipse. The railing shuddered. Ropes snapped. Somewhere below, water was rushing in. Time had run out. Then, the choice was made for them. A scream tore through the night as one of the crew, a young deckhand named Ellis, was suddenly gone. One moment he had been gripping the rigging, and the next he was in the air, his arms flailing as something yanked him violently over the side. The men surged toward the railing just in time to see him hit the water. For a brief second, Ellis floated, his wide, uncomprehending eyes locked onto Julian's. Then, before anyone could react, the glowing hands of the drowned reached up from below, seizing him. He didn't even have time to struggle. In an instant, he was pulled under. The humming stopped. The Eclipse rocked gently, as if nothing had happened. The sea, still glowing, smoothed itself into an eerie stillness. The drowned figures were gone. The thing below, whatever it was, had been appeased. Julian staggered back, unable to look away from the place where Ellis had disappeared. His mind screamed at him to do something, to fight, to mourn, to rage. But all he could do was stand there, frozen, as the sea swallowed its offering. No one spoke. No one moved. Then Blackthorn turned from the rail, adjusting his coat as if nothing had happened. His voice was calm, commanding. "We sail on." And just like that, the nightmare continued. The Eclipse drifted forward, cutting through the strangely tranquil waters, but the silence that followed Ellis's disappearance was far from peaceful. It was an unnatural, stifling hush, as if the sea itself held its breath, waiting to see what the men would do now that the debt had been paid. No one spoke. No one moved more than necessary. Even the wind had abandoned them, leaving the sails limp and the ship adrift in eerie stillness. Julian gripped the railing, his knuckles white, his thoughts tangled in the horror of what had just happened. Ellis had barely been more than a boy, eager to prove himself, the kind of sailor who never shied away from work. Now he was gone, stolen by something they could not fight, could not even see, and no one had lifted a finger to save him. Across the deck, Tobias sat slumped against a coil of rope, staring at the planks beneath his feet. His face was blank, but his hands trembled. Rourke, on the other hand, stood rigid, his jaw clenched so tight it looked like it might snap. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, dangerous. "That thing will come back," he said, addressing no one in particular. "And next time it'll want more." Blackthorn's cold gaze flicked toward him. "Then we best keep sailing," he said simply. He turned away, walking to the helm as if they had not just witnessed a man dragged to his death. Rourke's fists tightened at his sides. "That's it? That's all you have to say?" Blackthorn didn't turn around. "The sea is never fair, Rourke. You should know that by now." Julian expected Rourke to lash out, to throw a punch or a curse, but instead, he let out a sharp, bitter laugh. "The sea didn't take Ellis," he spat. "That thing did. And you knew, didn't you?" For a long moment, Blackthorn said nothing. Then, softly, without looking back, he replied, "I knew the risks." A dark realization settled over the crew. Blackthorn had sailed this course before. He had known something waited beneath the waves. Yet he had taken them into its territory anyway. Julian swallowed the sick feeling rising in his throat. Had Blackthorn been hoping they would escape without a sacrifice? Or had he always known someone would have to be given to the deep? As if sensing the weight of their growing resentment, the captain finally turned to face them. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes burned with something unreadable: resolve, guilt, or something else entirely. "We are not out of danger yet," he said. "We sail, or we die." No one argued. They had no choice but to obey. But as Julian turned back to the dark, glowing waters, he could not shake the feeling that they had not truly escaped at all. The thing below had been satisfied for now, but the sea was vast, and hungry things had long memories. The wind returned at dawn, but it carried with it an unnatural chill. It was the kind of cold that settled deep in the bones, that had nothing to do with the air and everything to do with something unseen. The Eclipse sailed on, but the men were silent, their movements sluggish, as if the weight of the previous night had left them drained. No one spoke of Ellis. No one dared to. Julian took the first watch, standing at the bow with Tobias by his side. The sea stretched endlessly before them, the water still pulsing faintly with that unnatural green glow, but the surface was smooth. Too smooth. It was as if the ocean itself had stopped breathing. "Something's wrong," Tobias muttered. His voice was hoarse, as if he hadn't slept, or perhaps, like Julian, he hadn't dared to. The winds picked up, but the water's still. "Have you ever seen the sea like this?" Julian shook his head. "No." They lapsed into silence, both watching, waiting. The Eclipse moved forward steadily, its sails full, but the world around them felt stagnant. Then, as the first rays of morning sun crept across the horizon, a thick wall of fog appeared in the distance. It was sudden, unnatural there one moment, gone the next, then back again, shifting like something alive. Rourke joined them, frowning as he watched the mist crawl toward them. "That's no ordinary fog," he muttered. "It moves against the wind." Julian felt his pulse quicken. The mist had begun to take shape. Shadowy figures flickered within it, appearing and vanishing just as quickly. At first, he thought his eyes were playing tricks on him, but then he heard it, a sound like whispers carried on the wind. The whispers grew louder as the fog thickened, curling around the ship like grasping fingers. The men on deck grew restless, shifting uneasily, hands moving toward weapons they all knew would be useless. Blackthorn stood at the helm, his posture rigid, his eyes scanning the fog. If he was afraid, he did not show it. Then, through the swirling mist, the first figure stepped forward. It was a man, or what had once been a man. His face was gaunt, his skin a sickly gray, stretched thin over sharp bones. His eyes were hollow, black pits that seemed to absorb the dim light. His clothes were tattered, dripping with seawater, as if he had just crawled from the depths. Julian's breath caught in his throat as more figures emerged. Dozens, then hundreds. Some stood motionless on the shifting mist, watching. Others moved forward in slow, deliberate steps, their bodies flickering like candlelight. The whispers turned to voices. Not one voice, but many, overlapping, merging, speaking in languages Julian did not recognize. And then, amidst the chaos of sound, he heard something familiar. Julian, his own name, spoken in a voice he had not heard in years. A voice that should not be here. His blood turned to ice as he whipped around, searching. And then he saw her. Eliza, his sister, dead for over a decade, drowned in a storm when she was only 12. But she stood there now, at the edge of the deck, her long hair dripping, her wide, unblinking eyes locked onto his. "Come," she whispered, reaching out. The ship lurched violently, throwing Julian to the deck. The fog swallowed everything, and then nothing, just silence. The world had vanished into fog. It was a thick, living thing, curling around the eclipse like a serpent, suffocating sound, stealing light. The deck beneath Julian felt unsteady, as though the ship were floating on something far less certain than water. The whispers had faded, replaced by a silence more terrifying than noise. Julian pushed himself up from the deck, his breath coming in ragged gasps. His sister had been there. He had seen her, but now she was gone, swallowed by the mist. His hands trembled as he tried to make sense of what had just happened. A heavy boot step behind him made him whirl around. Rourke stood there, his face pale and set like stone. "Did you see them?" he asked, his voice low, wary. Julian swallowed. "I saw. Someone I knew. Someone who—" He hesitated, the words catching in his throat. "Someone who shouldn't be here." Rourke's jaw tightened. "You're not the only one." From all around the ship, murmurs of fear began to rise. The crew had seen their own ghosts, figures from the past, long dead but somehow here. Some men stood frozen, staring into the mist with glassy eyes. Others moved with frantic urgency, as though afraid to stay in one place for too long. Tobias stumbled forward, his face twisted in panic. "We have to move," he rasped. "We have to get out of this fog." Blackthorne stood at the helm, staring into the white void ahead. His grip on the wheel was tight, his expression unreadable. "The wind has died," he said flatly. "We are adrift." Panic rippled through the crew. To be trapped in a dead calm was one thing, but to be trapped here, in this cursed mist, with these things lurking in the shadows, was another. The men looked to Blackthorne for guidance, but the captain remained eerily composed. Then, from deep within the fog, something moved. A shape, a dark, towering silhouette, materialized off the port side. It was massive, far larger than any ship, and yet it moved with unnatural silence, gliding through the water like a phantom. Julian's breath caught in his throat. It was a ship that should not exist. Its masts were splintered, its sails in tatters, and its hull was blackened as if by fire. Ghostly blue lanterns flickered along its rails, casting an eerie glow onto the water. But what chilled Julian to the core were the figures lining its deck. They were motionless, dozens of them, standing in ragged rows. Their faces were hollow, their eyes empty sockets, their bodies draped in rotted clothing. And then, all at once, they turned their heads. The silence shattered. The whispers came flooding back, surging over the ship like a rising tide. But this time, there were words, clear, insidious words that clawed their way into Julian's mind. "You do not belong here. Leave this place. Before it takes you to..." A bell rang out. One deep, resonant toll that vibrated through the ship's wooden frame. The ghost ship was calling to them, and something in the fog was answering. The bell's mournful toll echoed through the fog, reverberating in Julian's bones. It was not just a sound, it was a summons. The ghostly ship loomed beside the eclipse, its decayed sails motionless, its spectral crew watching in eerie silence. The whispering voices had stopped, but their weight lingered in the air like the pressure before a storm. Julian tore his gaze away from the figures on the phantom vessel and turned to Blackthorne. The captain's face was set in grim determination, his grip white-knuckled on the wheel. For the first time since the voyage had begun, there was something in his eyes that resembled uncertainty. "We can't stay here," Tobias murmured beside Julian. His voice was barely more than a breath, as if speaking too loudly would shatter the fragile space between them and the impossible. "That ship, it wants something." Julian's mind raced. The ghost ship was calling. But to whom? The eclipse had been drifting, carried into this fog like a fly into a web. Was it mere misfortune, or had something guided them here? Had Ellis's disappearance been the beginning of something much larger? Then, from the depths beneath them, came a sound. A low, resonant groan that did not belong to the ship or the sea. It was deep, primordial, something ancient stirring in the abyss below. The crew collectively froze. The sound came again, this time closer, vibrating through the hull of the Eclipse. It was the kind of noise that made men think of things too large to name, things that belonged to nightmares and forgotten legends. Julian forced himself to move, to breathe. "Did anyone feel that?" he whispered. Rourke nodded, his expression dark. And I don't think we're alone in the water." The stillness of the sea suddenly made sense. The unnatural calm was not a blessing, but a warning. Something below them had stilled the waves, as if the ocean itself were holding its breath. Then, without warning, the ghost ship's crew lifted their skeletal hands and pointed downward, toward the depths. The fog thickened in response, swirling in chaotic patterns, and Julian felt it then, a presence, vast and watching. Whatever lurked beneath them was aware of the eclipse, and it was no longer content to wait. The ship lurched. A deep, resonant force struck the hull from below, sending men staggering. A splash erupted off the port side, but the water swallowed whatever had broken the surface before anyone could see. "Captain," a crewman shouted. "Something's moving down there." Blackthorn's jaw clenched. "I can feel it." His voice was calm, but there was something strained beneath it. Julian looked again at the ghostly figures on the ship beside them. Their hollow eyes remained locked on the eclipse, their silent warning clear. The eclipse was on borrowed time. Then came another sound, more terrifying than anything before. A long, wet, inhuman breath rising from the deep. And whatever had taken Ellis was coming back for more. The ocean had become a vast, silent chasm beneath the eclipse, pressing down on them like an oppressive weight. Julian's skin prickled with the sensation of being watched, not by the spectral crew of the ghost ship, not by the fog, but by something far older, far darker. The deep, the abyss. It was as though the very sea itself had turned against them. The sound from beneath the ship had not stopped. It was there, pulsing in the depths, louder now, like the heartbeat of some ancient beast stirring in the black water. Julian could almost feel the pressure building in the hull, the wooden planks groaning in protest, as if they too sensed the growing danger. The crew stood on edge, their eyes flicking nervously to the water, their hands hovering near weapons they knew would be of no use. The air was thick, dense, every movement feeling slow and deliberate. The unnatural stillness had descended again, but it was different now. It was not the calm before a storm. It was the eerie silence of the hunt. Rourke approached Julian, his voice a low growl. "There's something down there, Julian. It's been there longer than we have. Longer than the ship has." His eyes were wide, frantic. "What do we do? We can't outrun it." Julian swallowed hard, unable to offer any solution. Their situation was spiraling, and he knew it. There was no wind to push them forward. And if the Phantom ship had been anything but a warning, then the eclipse was nothing more than a floating target. "Captain," Tobias called out from across the deck, his face pale. "We can't stay like this. We have to do something." Blackthorn did not respond immediately. His eyes were focused on the water, his mind clearly processing something far beyond the visible. "We wait," he said finally, his voice tight with unspoken command. "The wind will come back, and we'll leave. We just need to hold out a little longer." But Julian could hear the hesitation in his voice, the doubt. Blackthorn, the unflappable captain, had always been in control, but now even he seemed unsure. The crew was beginning to feel it too. The panic that had begun to settle in their hearts, the gnawing sensation that they might not escape this alive. A distant creaking, coming from the direction of the ghost ship, drew their attention. Julian turned just in time to see it. A massive, shadowy tendril rising from the sea, reaching toward the eclipse. It was thick, like the limb of some colossal sea creature, slick and glistening in the mist. It slithered across the water with unnatural speed, its surface rippling with an ominous energy. A scream broke the silence. One of the crewmen, standing at the port side, had caught sight of it too late. The tendril shot forward with terrifying precision, wrapping around his legs before he could even react. He was yanked from the deck with a force so violent that his body slammed into the railing before disappearing into the deep with a sickening splash. No one moved. No one spoke. The crew was paralyzed with fear, watching the spot where the man had been taken, their hearts pounding in their chests. The tendril recoiled back into the water, vanishing as quickly as it had come, leaving only ripples behind. Blackthorn's voice cut through the silence, sharp and commanding. "Prepare the weapons. Now!" Julian's hands shook as he stumbled toward the starboard side, where the ship's few remaining weapons were stored. He had no idea what they were about to face, but it was clear they had no choice but to fight. The Eclipse had become a prison, and whatever lurked beneath was closing in. The fog was thickening again, the figures on the ghost ship no longer visible. Had they retreated into the mist, or was the ship simply waiting for the right moment to strike? Julian couldn't tell. All he knew was that time was running out. "Get ready," Blackthorn ordered. His voice was quieter now, tinged with something more than authority. It was the sound of a man who knew they had reached the point of no return. And for the first time since they had set sail, Julian knew in his gut that survival might not be an option. The Eclipse swayed violently on the water, the once serene sea now a churned abyss, teeming with dangers unknown. The ominous tendril that had claimed one of the crew was still fresh in the minds of the men who had witnessed it. The fear that had once lingered at the back of their thoughts had now cemented itself in their very bones, and the ship had become a trap, not just in the physical sense, but in the psychological sense as well. They were trapped between the ghost ship's relentless presence, the monstrous entity from below, and the overwhelming weight of their own growing panic. Julian stood near the bow, his fingers gripping the rail as he tried to peer through the dense fog that enveloped the Eclipse. His eyes were wide, darting from one end of the ship to the other, searching for any sign, any movement that might indicate the next attack. His breath came in shallow bursts, the mist thick around him, almost suffocating. He had seen men die in battles before, but nothing had prepared him for the terror that was unfolding now. Nothing could have. The sound from the depths had not ceased, and it seemed to be growing louder, like the roaring of some ancient leviathan rising from the darkened waters. Every creak of the ship, every snap of the sails in the breeze, sent his heart into overdrive. The Eclipse was drifting helplessly, and he could feel it, a sinking sensation, not just in the ship but in the very air itself. They were being pulled under, drawn deeper into something they couldn't understand, couldn't fight. "We have to move," Rourke's voice broke through the fog, his tone tense. He stood beside Julian, his face pale as he scanned the water. "This ship is cursed. It's pulling us down with it." Julian turned to face him. His stomach churned. "How do you mean cursed? The ship was here before us. This wasn't just an accident, was it?" Rourke's eyes narrowed as he looked back at the direction of the ghost ship. "I don't think it's the ship that's cursed. I think it's the sea itself. Whatever's out there." He gestured toward the fog and the churning water below. "It wants something, and we're not meant to leave." The words hung heavy in the air between them. But before Julian could respond, a guttural, throaty growl rumbled from beneath the surface. The sound was closer this time, almost deafening. Julian's heart raced, the blood in his veins running cold. He staggered back from the edge, feeling the unmistakable sensation that something immense was moving directly beneath the ship, circling them. There was no question anymore. It wasn't just a creature. It was something ancient, something that had existed long before mankind had even set foot on the seas. Suddenly, the fog parted in a wide arc, revealing the outline of the ghost ship once more. But this time, it was no longer just a faint silhouette in the mist. The Eclipse was close now, dangerously close. The water between them seemed to pulse with energy, a low, dark tide rising as though something below was feeding off their presence. The spectral crew stood at the railing of the ghost ship, their hollow eyes fixed upon the Eclipse. But something was different now. Their gestures had shifted from passive observation to active command, as if they were beckoning them, urging them to take the next step into the depths below. "We can't stay here much longer," Blackthorn's voice cut through the rising tension. The captain had appeared on the deck, his face tight with the strain of command. Whatever that thing is below us, it's not waiting for us to make the first move. We'll have to act quickly, or we'll be consumed. The crew was gathered now, weapons drawn and faces set with the hard resolve of men who knew they were facing something beyond their control. They could hear the shift in the water, the strange, rhythmic thumping coming from below the surface. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't just a threat. It was intelligent, deliberate, and it had made its move. The Eclipse was its prey. As the tension mounted, the water around the ship began to churn violently, sending waves crashing against the hull. The ship rocked on its foundations, groaning under the strain. Julian could see Blackthorn shout orders to the crew, but it was too late. The sea had made its move. A massive shadow surged from below, slamming into the side of the ship with a force so great that Julian was thrown off his feet, crashing into the deck. The sound of cracking would echoed in the chaos, and Julian scrambled to his feet, his heart hammering in his chest. The water was rising, lapping at the edges of the ship, and from the blackened depths, a gargantuan form began to emerge, something enormous, its shape barely discernible beneath the surface. It was the thing from the depths, the creature that had claimed Ellis and was now coming for them all. It was only when the first tendril shot up onto the deck, wrapping itself around a mast with terrifying speed, that Julian realized the full scale of the nightmare they were in. The creature wasn't merely attacking. It was taking the ship, piece by piece, dragging it down into the depths with an unrelenting hunger. With a final scream of desperation, Blackthorn barked, "Prepare to abandon ship. Get to the lifeboats, now!" But the sea was already closing in. The Eclipse was sinking, and no lifeboat would be fast enough. It had begun, a descent into the void, where only the shadows of the deep awaited them. The chaos that had ensued after the creature's assault was nothing short of catastrophic. The Eclipse lurched and groaned as the monstrous tendrils lashed against the ship, pulling with force that seemed to transcend nature. Julian barely had time to grasp what was happening before he was tossed violently to the floor, the ship tilting at a grotesque angle. The sound of splintering wood filled the air, and the once proud vessel was now a shadow of its former self, on the brink of destruction. Adrenaline surged through Julian's veins as he struggled to rise to his feet, gripping the nearest railing to steady himself. The crew was in disarray, men running in every direction, shouting over the cacophony of cracking timbers and the monstrous thundering of the creature's attack. The ship's hull was rapidly filling with water, and the lifeboats were now nothing but futile hopes. The vast blackness beneath the ship had consumed the Eclipse's stability, and nothing remained but a desperate, frantic scramble for survival. "We need to get to the aft." Blackthorn's voice cut through the madness, his presence still commanding despite the panic that gripped the ship. Julian turned to see the captain standing at the edge of the deck, his eyes wide with understanding. The Eclipse was doomed. "To the lifeboats." But the moment the words left Blackthorn's lips, a piercing scream tore through the air. One of the crewmen had been dragged overboard by one of the tendrils, disappearing into the roiling sea with a shrill wail. The sight was enough to freeze the blood of even the most hardened sailors, and for a moment, no one moved. The sound of the creature's movements was deafening now, and it seemed to fill every corner of the world. The Eclipse was sinking faster than Julian had thought possible, and the terror of the deep was closing in. Despite the overwhelming chaos, Julian found himself moving, his body propelled by a primal instinct that drove him toward the rear of the ship. He couldn't see Rourke or Tobias, but the faces of the crew were blurs of panic and fear as they rushed in every direction, seeking any form of escape. Julian knew, deep down, that not all of them would make it out. The creature was hungry, and the sea was its domain. As he reached the aft, he saw Blackthorn and several others already preparing the lifeboats. The captain's eyes were wild with determination, but there was a deep, unspoken resignation in them now. He knew as well as anyone that survival was no longer a guarantee. "Get in now?" Blackthorn barked, his voice low and urgent. But as the first of the men scrambled into the lifeboats, a loud crash echoed from the lower decks of the ship. The sound sent a chill through Julian, and instinctively, He turned toward the noise. What he saw made his stomach churn. A vast, writhing mass had broken through the hull, and the creature was now emerging fully from the depths below, its dark, bloated form rising with grotesque speed. The sight was enough to steal away any lingering hope. Its eyes, if they could be called eyes, were vast, empty voids, radiating a sense of ancient malice and hunger. Its body, slick and undulating, looked as if it were made of the very essence of the sea itself, a grotesque amalgamation of tendrils, flesh, and darkness. "Get in the boats, Julian!" Blackthorn shouted again, his voice shaking. The captain was no longer the confident, commanding figure he had been. In his eyes, Julian saw fear, raw, unfiltered fear. The Eclipse was beyond saving. They were no longer captains of the ship. They were mere survivors clinging to a rapidly sinking vessel. Julian hesitated, torn between the instinct to flee and the need to face the horror before him. He had seen many things in his life: pirates, storms, disease, but nothing had prepared him for this. The creature, this being, was something beyond their understanding. It defied logic, defied reason. It existed in a space outside of human comprehension, an entity from the deepest, most forgotten places of the earth, a thing that had long ago abandoned any trace of humanity. As Julian scrambled into one of the remaining lifeboats, he cast one final glance toward the Eclipse. The ship was sinking, the water rising higher and higher, the sea consuming it whole. He could see the other lifeboats now, the men frantically rowing away from the wreckage, trying to escape the grip of the beast that lurked beneath. But as they pulled away, a sudden, overwhelming force tugged at the boat, pulling it back toward the abyss. A scream split the air as another tendril shot up from the water, its enormous length wrapping around one of the lifeboats and dragging it back into the sea. Julian's stomach lurched as the sight of the helpless men, struggling, flailing, was consumed by the black water. The sea was ravenous, and no one was safe. "We need to go." Rourke's voice reached Julian's ears, snapping him back to reality. The boat was still moving, still alive, but they weren't far enough away. The creature was still there, its presence an ever-growing shadow on the water. Julian pushed the oar with all his strength, not daring to look back at the ship that had once been their salvation. Instead, he focused on the horizon, if there was a horizon left in this hellish place. The Eclipse was gone. The creature was still there. And in the face of such terror, Julian could not help but wonder, if the sea had claimed their ship, what else might it claim before the night was over? In the hours following their escape, the lifeboats bobbed aimlessly upon the cold, endless expanse of the sea. Julian, Rourke, and a handful of others clung to the fragile hope that they had outrun the nightmare that had overtaken the Eclipse. Yet, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the water, a haunting silence fell over the survivors. The chaos of the past hours seemed almost unreal in its sudden absence. The storm had passed, but the danger had not. Julian could feel it in his bones. The air, thick and oppressive, weighed heavily upon him, as though the ocean itself was holding its breath. The stars above twinkled eerily, but their light seemed distant, unreachable, as if mocking their insignificance in the face of the unknown. There was no wind, no movement, only the occasional creak of the boat and the soft splashes of water lapping against its sides. As the minutes stretched into hours, the group fell into a strange, almost unnatural quiet. No one spoke. There was nothing to say. What could they say? They had seen the unthinkable. They had watched their ship, their home, be swallowed by the depths, devoured by a creature of nightmares. And now, adrift in the middle of nowhere, they were left with the uncomfortable knowledge that they were at the mercy of the very same sea that had turned against them. Rourke was the first to break the silence, his voice low, almost a whisper. "Do you think it's gone?" The question hung in the air, unanswered. Julian turned his gaze toward him, but the answer was clear. They all knew the truth. They had not escaped. The creature, whatever it was still out there, waiting. The crewman sitting next to Rourke shifted uncomfortably, glancing nervously over the side of the boat, as though expecting the tendrils to rise from the water at any moment. "We shouldn't be here," he muttered, his face pale. "We need to find land. We need to get out of this cursed sea." His words, though whispered, seemed to echo in the stillness, and the others around him nodded in uneasy agreement. They had to leave this place, to put as much distance between themselves and the nightmare as possible. But the sea, vast and unyielding, offered no answers. The horizon remained unchanged, an endless stretch of inky blackness with no land in sight. The stars above seemed to mock them with their cold, distant beauty, offering no guidance, no hope. Julian felt a rising panic in his chest as he realized just how far they were from safety. The eclipse had been their only connection to the world, and now that it was gone, they were stranded, adrift in a sea that seemed to have swallowed not just their ship, but their very future. Hours passed, and the fatigue began to take its toll on the survivors. The lack of food and water, combined with the overwhelming fear, left them feeling weak and disoriented. Julian tried to sleep, but each time he closed his eyes, his mind would flood with images of the creature, the dark, endless void of its eyes, the grotesque slithering of its form as it emerged from the depths. He could still hear the sound of the wood splintering, the screams of those who had been lost to the sea. It was as if the memory of the creature had embedded itself in his mind, and no amount of sleep could rid him of its presence. "Is this the end?" Rourke's voice again shattered the silence, this time filled with a note of despair. "Is this where we die? Alone, stranded in the middle of the ocean, with no hope of rescue?" The question lingered in the air, unanswered, but it was one that burned in each of their hearts. None of them had asked for this. None of them had wanted to be part of this madness. They were ordinary men, cast into extraordinary circumstances. They had only wanted to make a living, to see the world. And now, it seemed, the world had turned on them. Julian wiped the salt water from his brow and gazed out over the water, feeling the pull of an overwhelming despair. "We can't give up," he said, though the words sounded hollow even to his own ears. "If we give up, we're already dead." But even as he said the words, he wondered if it was already too late. They had escaped the eclipse, but had they truly escaped the creature? The sea had a way of keeping its secrets, and Julian was beginning to fear that the creature was not the only horror lurking beneath the waves. Just as the silence threatened to swallow them whole, a distant sound broke through the stillness, faint but unmistakable. The sound of something moving in the water, a ripple, a shift in the waves. Julian's heart leapt into his throat as he strained his eyes to see, but the night offered no answers. It could have been nothing, but deep down he knew it wasn't. They were not alone. In the quiet, unsettling darkness of the sea, Julian could feel the weight of the truth bearing down on him. Whatever was out there, whatever had destroyed the eclipse, it wasn't finished. The creature, or whatever it was still hunting them, and they were trapped, with no way to escape the madness that awaited them in the cold, unforgiving waters. As the hours drifted by in a haze of exhaustion, fear, and uncertainty, Julian's mind began to blur the lines between reality and nightmare. The surface of the sea stretched out endlessly, an unbroken expanse of dark water that seemed to swallow all hope. Even the stars overhead, once comforting in their distance, now felt ominous, pinpricks of light mocking their helplessness in the vast, uncaring void of the ocean. Each survivor seemed to retreat into their own mind, seeking solace or escape from the terror that had gripped them. The boat, a flimsy vessel in the face of the open sea, rocked gently with the currents, but there was no comfort in its motions. The knowledge that the creature still haunted the depths beneath them weighed heavily on every breath they took. Julian found himself staring at the water, willing it to remain still, to prove that nothing lurked beneath its surface. But deep down, he knew better. Rourke was the first to break the uneasy silence that had fallen over the group. His voice, raw and trembling, cut through the night like a blade. "We need to talk about it," he said. His words hung in the air, heavy with a sense of inevitability. "We can't keep pretending that we're just waiting for rescue. We need to face the truth. What happened out there on the ship, it wasn't just a storm. Something took the eclipse. The rest of the group shifted uncomfortably, exchanging uneasy glances. They had all felt it, the unnatural stillness, the haunting presence in the water, but none had dared to voice the words that Rourke had just spoken. The creature, whatever it was, had not been a natural force of the sea. It had been something else, something far older, far more malevolent. And now it was following them. "We can't outrun it," Julian said, his voice low but certain. "We can't keep sailing in circles, hoping it'll lose interest. It's out there watching us, and I think we've already become its prey." His words settled like a weight on the survivors' shoulders. The crushing silence that followed was deafening. How could they have outrun something so ancient, so relentless? How could they fight what they didn't understand? One of the survivors, a young man named Daniel, spoke up, his voice barely a whisper. "I keep thinking back to the eclipse, how it felt when it sank, the way it just disappeared beneath the waves. It wasn't like anything I've ever seen. It didn't just sink, it was dragged down. And I swear I saw something else moving under the water, something huge, something that shouldn't have been there." The others were silent, each lost in their own thoughts, their own private terror. They had all seen it, felt it, this otherworldly presence that had torn the eclipse apart. None of them had been brave enough to acknowledge it fully, to say the words aloud. But now, in the depths of the night, surrounded by the crushing blackness of the sea, it was impossible to ignore. Could it be real? Rourke asked, the doubt in his voice betraying the uncertainty that had begun to consume him. I mean, what if we're just imagining things? What if we're just broken? What if it's just the fear twisting our minds? Julian shook his head. "I don't think it's just fear. Whatever we saw out there, it's real. And it's not going to stop until it gets what it wants." His voice trailed off as he stared into the blackness ahead, wondering just how long they could last before the creature closed in on them. Suddenly, the boat rocked violently. A loud, jarring crash echoed through the night, sending all of them scrambling to their feet, eyes wide with panic. The water churned around them, and for a moment, Julian thought he saw something moving just beneath the surface, dark, shifting shapes, impossibly large, surrounding them. His heart pounded in his chest as he reached for an oar, the only weapon at his disposal. But the shapes disappeared as quickly as they had appeared, vanishing into the depths without a trace. The sea stilled once more, as if mocking their fears. But the damage had already been done. The terror had returned, sharper, more immediate than ever before. "I saw it," Daniel whispered, his face pale. "I saw it move just below us. It's out there. It's real." Julian nodded grimly. "I know. It's coming for us. And I don't think we can outrun it anymore." The night wore on in agonizing silence, each passing minute stretching out like an eternity. Every creak of the boat, every ripple in the water, seemed to signal the approach of the creature. Julian's thoughts were consumed by it. What was it? Where had it come from? And most importantly, what did it want? These questions circled his mind, unanswerable, gnawing at him as they drifted deeper into the sea. As dawn's first light began to break over the horizon, a cold realization settled in. They were no longer fighting for survival in the traditional sense. They weren't just trying to stay alive. They were fighting for their very souls. The creature wasn't just hunting them. It was feeding on their fear, their despair. And it wasn't going to stop until it had claimed them all. Julian felt a chill run down his spine as he gazed out at the horizon. They had entered a realm beyond reason, beyond anything they could have prepared for. The sea had become their prison, and the creature was its warden. There was no escape. The only question left was, how much longer could they hold on before the ocean claimed them, too? The morning after the terror of the night before was deceptively calm. A faint light crept over the horizon, casting an ethereal glow across the still waters. For a moment, the survivors allowed themselves to believe that maybe, just maybe, the worst had passed. They sat in silence, watching the sun rise over an ocean that, for the first time in days, seemed almost tranquil. The waters stretched out before them, glistening like glass, devoid of the monstrous shapes that had haunted their thoughts. Julian, however, could not shake the uneasy feeling gnawing at the pit of his stomach. The silence was wrong. There was no wind to fill the sails, no waves to rock the boat in their usual rhythm. The water was unnaturally still, like the calm before a storm, or worse, like the quiet of something waiting to strike. He glanced over at Rourke and Daniel, who seemed to be lost in their own thoughts, but their faces told the same story. They had seen the creature. They knew it was coming. "We need to prepare," Julian said finally, his voice cutting through the silence. It sounded too loud, too intrusive in the stillness. But the words felt necessary. "We need to be ready for when it comes back." Rourke, who had been staring out at the water, nodded grimly. "It's not over. Not by a long shot." The others exchanged uneasy glances but said nothing. The truth was, they were all exhausted, physically and mentally. The strain of being at the mercy of the sea, of the unknown creature, of their own fears, was beginning to take its toll. They had no clear direction, no way to outrun their pursuer, and every creak of the boat now seemed like the harbinger of doom. But then came a sound, a faint, unnatural hum, barely perceptible at first. It was not the usual sound of the wind or the waves. It was something deeper, more resonant. The hairs on Julian's neck stood up as the sound grew louder, pulsing through the air like a heartbeat. He turned to the others. Their faces were pale, eyes wide, as they slowly turned toward the sound. From the depths of the ocean, a low, rumbling growl began to echo around them, reverberating through the boat's wooden frame. The water, so still just moments before, now seemed to tremble beneath their feet. The sound was unmistakable. It was the creature, or perhaps something even worse, something they had not yet fully understood. "What is that?" Daniel gasped, his voice trembling with fear. Julian's mind raced, trying to process what was happening. The creature had never made a sound like this before. This wasn't the crashing of waves or the scraping of the boat against debris. No, this was something else, something far more deliberate, far more intentional. The growl deepened, vibrating through their bones. Julian felt the vibrations in his chest, a warning that sent a wave of cold dread surging through him. The creature was near, closer than they had imagined. He scanned the water, his heart pounding in his ears. But the surface remained undisturbed. No movement, no sign of life beneath the calm, endless blue. Suddenly, a shadow broke the surface, a massive, undulating shape moving through the water with terrifying speed. It was larger than anything they had ever seen, its form writhing and shifting like a creature made of the sea itself. The shadow darted beneath the boat, and in that moment, Julian understood. The creature wasn't merely hunting them. It was feeding on them, drawing closer with every hour that passed. The deeper they ventured into the ocean, the more it could sense their fear, their weakness. And now, it was preparing to strike. "We need to move," Rourke shouted, breaking the trance they had all been in. "We can't just sit here and wait for it to tear us apart." But Julian knew there was no running from this. The sea, with all its vastness and power, had already become their prison. No matter which direction they tried to sail in, the creature would be there, lurking just beneath the surface, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. As the shadow passed beneath them again, this time much closer, the boat lurched violently to one side, nearly capsizing them all. Julian gripped the edge of the vessel, his knuckles white. Panic swept through the group as they struggled to maintain their balance, but the threat was unmistakable. The creature was toying with them. It was enjoying their terror. For the first time since the Eclipse had been destroyed, Julian felt truly helpless. The survival instincts that had once guided him, those primal human impulses to fight or flee, were now meaningless. There was no fight against this creature. It was beyond them. It was ancient, far older than anything they could comprehend. And in the face of such a force, all they could do was endure. Daniel, shaking, pointed toward the horizon. "Look, there's something in the distance." The others turned, their eyes squinting into the distance. Julian could make out a faint shape on the horizon, barely visible against the morning sky. A ship, perhaps? A sign of rescue? But Julian knew better than to hope. Whatever it was too far away to be of any use. As the shadow beneath them grew larger, the hum continued to intensify, almost like the sound of a distant storm. The boat rocked again, this time with such force that it felt like the sea itself was trying to swallow them whole. Julian's heart raced, his mind spinning with thoughts of what they could do next. What would be their fate? Would they even survive another night on these cursed waters? But then, in the back of his mind, a terrible realization crept in. What if the creature wasn't just a predator? What if it had been here all along? What if it had been waiting for them to come to it, luring them deeper into the abyss with every passing hour, until there was nowhere left to run? And in that moment, Julian understood. They were not survivors. They were the prey, and the creature was no longer playing by any rules of the natural world. It had all the time in the world, and it was patient. The sensation of helplessness grew stronger with each passing hour. The boat swayed gently, as if in response to a wind that no one could feel. It was an eerie calm, as if the ocean itself were holding its breath, waiting for something or someone. Julian couldn't help but feel the weight of this unnatural stillness pressing on him, as though it were a precursor to an impending disaster. The creature was still out there, somewhere below the surface, but there was no movement, no sign of its presence. Instead, there was only the silence. It was oppressive and suffocating, more terrifying than any howling wind or crashing wave. His mind raced, trying to make sense of the situation. The creature had circled them multiple times over the past few days, never fully revealing itself, always lurking just out of sight. Yet now it was gone. But the absence of the creature was no comfort. It was worse, much worse. The fear of the unknown weighed on him like a lead blanket, and each creak of the boat sounded like the harbinger of something far darker than mere silence. He couldn't help but wonder if the creature was waiting for something. But what? The group huddled together, their faces drawn, their eyes hollow with exhaustion. They hadn't spoken much since the incident with the creature beneath the waves. Rourke had taken to pacing, his steps rapid and erratic. Daniel, on the other hand, sat motionless, staring into the distance with a vacant expression that unnerved Julian. It was as though their collective hope had been drained by the events of the past few days, leaving behind only an empty shell of survival instinct. As Julian surveyed their surroundings, he noticed something disturbing. The horizon had changed. The distant shape of the ship, the one they had spotted hours ago, was now gone. In its place, the horizon was empty, an endless expanse of water stretching out in all directions. Had they been drifting aimlessly all this time? How long had they been lost, completely unaware of their position in the vast, merciless sea? The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. There was no land in sight, no sign of civilization. They were completely alone. "It's like the ocean is playing tricks on us," Rourke muttered, as though reading Julian's thoughts. "There's nothing out here, just us in it." Daniel's eyes flickered, his body tense, as if bracing for some unseen attack. Maybe it's already here," he whispered. "Maybe it never left. Maybe it's been waiting for the perfect moment." Julian swallowed hard, trying to dismiss the thought. "No," he said, though his voice wavered. "We've seen it. We know what it can do. It's out there watching us, but it won't strike yet. It's waiting for something. What could it possibly be waiting for?" Rourke's voice was sharp, but there was a sense of desperation behind it, a plea for something to make sense. "We've been at its mercy for days. Why the silence now?" Julian didn't have an answer. The silence was unnerving, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Something was just out of reach, and they were teetering on the edge of something far worse than the creature itself. It was the feeling of being watched, of being lured into a trap with no way to escape. Suddenly, the calm was broken. A faint sound, so low it was almost imperceptible, reverberated through the boat. It wasn't the growl of the creature, nor was it the familiar sound of wind or waves. This sound was deeper, almost mechanical. It was the sound of something moving, but not the sea, not the natural rhythm of the water. "What the hell is that?" Daniel's voice was strained, his eyes wide with fear. Julian's breath caught in his throat as the sound grew louder. It wasn't coming from the water, but from the depths of the ship itself. The boat shuddered as if something enormous was beneath it, pushing against the hull. The noise was deafening now, a low, guttural rumble that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. Rourke's eyes darted to the deck below. "We need to get below," he said, his voice urgent. "Whatever that is, it's not good." But Julian didn't move. His feet felt rooted to the spot, as though some invisible force had taken hold of him. His heart was hammering in his chest as he tried to make sense of the sounds beneath them. The boat was rocking now, not from the waves, but from the force of whatever was pushing against it. The very foundations of the vessel felt like they were being strained to the breaking point. The others were already moving toward the hatch leading below deck, but Julian couldn't bring himself to follow. His instincts screamed at him to stay above, to stay in the open where the threat could be seen. But the noise continued, louder now, as if something, or someone, was trying to break free from the bowels of the ship. Then, without warning, the boat lurched violently. Julian was thrown to the deck, his body crashing against the wood with a sickening thud. For a moment, everything went black. When he came to, the boat was eerily still again. The sounds had stopped, but the silence that followed was worse than the noise. It was as though the ocean itself had swallowed everything whole. There were no waves, no sounds, nothing. Only the weight of the unnatural stillness pressing down on him. He struggled to his feet, his body aching from the fall, and looked around. The others were already on their feet, their faces pale, their expressions filled with the same unspoken fear. "What happened?" Daniel asked, his voice barely a whisper. Julian didn't have an answer. He didn't even know what to say. The ship was still intact, but the sense of dread was palpable. Something had happened, something that had shaken the very core of their existence on this ship. Whatever it wasn't over. Not by a long shot. "We need to keep moving," Julian said, though his voice was hollow, his words lacking conviction. "We can't stay here." But even as he said it, Julian knew it was too late. The calm had been broken, but in its wake, something far darker had taken root. The ocean was no longer just a vast expanse of water. It was a trap, a waiting, hungry void, and whatever was out there, waiting in the depths, had just made its move. The next day, or what they assumed to be day, came with an even more suffocating silence. Julian could no longer tell the time. There was no sun to guide them, no horizon to reference, just a thick, oppressive darkness that seemed to stretch on forever. The boat remained eerily still, suspended in a world where time had no meaning. It was as though they were caught in the eye of a storm that had never arrived, trapped in a limbo between the natural and the unnatural. The sense of being watched, of something lingering just beyond the limits of their perception, was becoming unbearable. Julian could feel it in his skin, in the hairs on the back of his neck, the prickling awareness that something was not right. His thoughts churned in a haze of fear and confusion, and every shadow seemed to hold a threat. The others, too, were beginning to unravel. Rourke paced in anxious circles, muttering under his breath as if trying to convince himself that they were still in control. Daniel was even quieter than usual, his eyes haunted, darting nervously at every creak and groan of the ship. The sense of impending doom was so thick in the air that even breathing felt like an effort. It was as if the boat itself had become a prison, trapping them inside an invisible cage. Julian had grown accustomed to the feeling of isolation that came with being out on the open sea, but this was different. This wasn't isolation. It was something far more sinister. It was as if the ocean itself was pushing them towards some unknown fate. But what that fate was, Julian couldn't say. Every time he tried to make sense of their situation, his thoughts became tangled. The creature, whatever it was out there, lurking beneath the water, but there was more to it than that. He could sense it, could feel the presence of something ancient and malevolent. It was watching, waiting not just for them, but for something else. What if this isn't just about us? Rourke said suddenly, breaking the silence. His voice trembled, as if he had come to a conclusion that had been gnawing at him for days. What if we're not the target at all? What if we're just part of something bigger? Julian turned toward him. What do you mean? Rourke's eyes were wide, filled with an unsettling mixture of fear and understanding. "I don't know," he said slowly, his words laced with doubt. "I keep thinking about the silence. It's not just the creature, is it? There's something else. Something watching us, waiting for us to figure it out." Julian felt a shiver run down his spine. Rourke's words rang true in a way that made his stomach churn. Whatever was out there, it wasn't just after them. It was part of something far bigger than any of them had imagined. The realization hit him like a hammer. The creature, the silence, the strange stillness. It wasn't a random sequence of events. They had stumbled into something much older, much darker than they could have ever imagined. "We need to get off this boat," Daniel muttered, his voice barely audible, but filled with a deep, primal desperation. "Whatever this is, we can't just sit here waiting for it to happen. Where will we go?" Julian asked, his voice heavy with the weight of the question. They were surrounded by water, and there was no land in sight. They were trapped, isolated in a vast, empty ocean with nowhere to run. Rourke slammed his fist into the deck, his frustration bubbling over. "It's not about running," he said, his voice raw. "It's about understanding what's happening before it's too late. We need to figure out what it is that's keeping us here." As Julian listened to Rourke's words, he couldn't help but feel the growing sense of dread. They were not in control. The ship was no longer a vessel of hope, but a coffin adrift in an endless sea. Something had changed, something deeper than the creature's attacks. They were caught in a game they couldn't understand, a game where the rules were hidden, and they were nothing more than pawns on a board too vast to comprehend. The thought of facing whatever lay beneath the surface, whatever force was manipulating their every move, was enough to freeze Julian's blood. They had already fought the creature. They had already been attacked, had already seen the horrors of the deep. But this was different. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about understanding something that had been hiding in the shadows for far longer than any of them had imagined. Julian stood at the edge of the deck, staring out at the vast expanse of water. It was like looking into an abyss that went on forever. The ocean stretched before him, cold and indifferent, an endless void that swallowed everything in its path. Yet within that endlessness, Julian could feel the presence of something watching them. Something ancient. Something that had been waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. The stillness was shattered by a sudden, sharp cry, one of the worst things Julian could have imagined. It was the sound of something in agony, the kind of cry that spoke of death and suffering, of something being ripped apart. The noise sent a jolt of terror through Julian's body, and he turned toward the others, his heart racing. Rourke's face had gone pale, and Daniel was already backing away from the edge of the ship, his eyes wide with fear. "What was that?" he asked, his voice trembling. "I don't know," Julian said, his throat dry. "But it's not over. Whatever this is, it's only just begun." The cry echoed again, this time followed by a low, guttural growl, a sound that vibrated through the boat and reverberated in Julian's chest. The creature was close. They weren't safe. They never would be. And then, from somewhere deep beneath the water, a dark shape began to emerge, rising slowly, as if testing the air, waiting to see if they were ready. Julian's breath caught in his throat. It was impossible to see clearly, but the shape was unmistakable. The creature was coming. It had returned, and this time, there was no running from it. As the dark shape emerged from the water, Julian's heart raced, his body paralyzed by the cold grip of fear. The creature, whatever it was, hovered just beneath the surface, its form barely distinguishable in the murky depths. For a moment, there was only silence, the kind of stillness that makes the air feel thick and heavy. Then, as if the ocean itself was holding its breath, the beast broke free of the water with a violent splash. The sound echoed through the air, a sharp, deafening noise that sent waves of terror through Julian and his crew. The creature was monstrous. Its scale was beyond anything Julian could have imagined, an unnatural size that defied the limits of nature. The thing seemed to defy logic, as though it existed outside the constraints of the physical world. It had no clear shape, no form that could be easily described. Its body rippled with unnatural, fluid motion, as if made of water itself. And its eyes, if they could even be called eyes, were dark, soulless voids that seemed to draw the light from the world around it. Rourke was the first to react, his voice a broken whisper that barely reached Julian's ears. This is what we've been running from." The words were filled with disbelief, as though even Rourke, the most hardened of them all, could not fully comprehend the terror before them. But Julian knew one thing for certain. It was real. It was here, and there was no escaping it now. The creature's movements were slow, deliberate, as it began to circle the ship, its dark form gliding effortlessly through the water. Julian could feel its presence pressing down on him, as though the very air around him had thickened, saturated with the weight of its malignant energy. Each movement the creature made caused ripples that seemed to reach into the depths of the sea, disturbing the surface in ways that were both unnatural and wrong. "What does it want?" Daniel asked, his voice strained, barely a whisper against the backdrop of silence that seemed to stretch endlessly before them. Julian didn't have an answer. He had no idea what the creature wanted. The only thing he knew for sure was that it was not of this world. It was something ancient, something born of the deep, forgotten by time, but not by the ocean itself. It was as if it had been waiting for something, waiting for them perhaps, waiting for this moment when they would be trapped, isolated, unable to escape its grasp. The creature suddenly lunged forward, its massive body surging through the water with an impossible speed, crashing against the side of the ship with a force that sent a shockwave through the deck. Julian stumbled, nearly losing his footing, but the others were not so lucky. Rourke was thrown to the ground, a sharp cry escaping his lips as he collided with the hardwood. Daniel clung to the nearest railing, his knuckles white from the effort of holding on. "What the hell is this thing?" Rourke yelled, struggling to get to his feet. He glanced up, eyes wild, searching for any possible escape route, but the ship was as trapped as they were. The creature let out an inhuman screech, a sound that seemed to shake the very core of the ship. The air seemed to vibrate with the intensity of it, and for a moment, Julian felt his mind slipping, like something was pulling at the edges of his consciousness. He shook his head, trying to clear the fog from his thoughts. This was no longer about survival. It was about understanding what they were up against and what they had to do to stop it. "The water, it's not just a habitat for this thing," Julian muttered, his voice trembling. It's its power. It's feeding off of the ocean. It's part of it." "What do you mean?" Rourke asked, his eyes narrowed in confusion. Julian took a deep breath, trying to piece together his fractured thoughts. The creature, the silence, everything we've seen, it's all connected. The water, the ocean, it's a conduit. Whatever this thing is, it doesn't just live in the water, it is the water. It is the very essence of the deep, and it's using the ocean to grow stronger. Rourke's face twisted with realization, and we're trapped in the middle of it. The creature's dark form surfaced again, and Julian could see that its body was not made of flesh or bone. It was as though it were constructed of water itself. Fluid, shapeless, impossible to comprehend. Yet there was something undeniably hostile about its presence. It was as though it recognized their fear, and it was savoring it, toying with them like prey. Suddenly, a new sound pierced the air, a deep, rumbling growl that seemed to come from everywhere at once. It vibrated through Julian's bones, sending tremors of fear through his entire body. The beast was communicating, but not with words. It was sending a signal, a frequency that resonated with something primal deep within them all. It was as if it was speaking in a language older than mankind itself, one that existed in the very fabric of the earth and sea. "It's not just a creature," Daniel said, his voice low and strained. "It's part of something bigger." Julian nodded, his mind racing. "Yes, this thing, it's connected to something ancient. It's a force of nature, a being that has existed for millennia. But it's not alone." Rourke's face grew pale, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and realization. "You mean there are others?" The question hung in the air, unanswered, as the creature surged toward the ship again, its movements erratic and frantic. This time, there was no warning, no build-up. It attacked with a fury that sent the entire boat rocking. the wood creaking and groaning as the beast's immense strength forced it to the brink of collapse. Julian felt the deck beneath him shudder, and he knew, without a doubt, that the ship would not survive much longer. They had to make a decision. They had to do something, anything, to stop the creature. But there was only one way to find out what it truly wanted, and Julian knew that it would require everything they had left. The question was no longer about how they could escape. It was about how they could fight back before it was too late. And in that moment, Julian realized that they had no choice but to face the beast head-on. The real fight was just beginning. Julian stared into the abyss below, his mind swirling with questions that had no answers. The beast had circled the ship with unnerving precision, its body shifting with an eerie fluidity as it tested the integrity of the vessel. Every crash against the hull sent a shockwave through the entire structure, weakening it bit by bit, like a predator slowly wearing down its prey. The crew, battered and exhausted, stood in stunned silence, too consumed by the enormity of the situation to act. It was no longer a question of surviving. They were now trapped in a battle of wills with something that was not only older than them, but older than human history itself. "We can't keep doing this," Rourke said, his voice thick with exhaustion. He stood near the edge of the ship, staring down into the water where the creature's form was barely visible beneath the surface. "This thing is relentless. It's like it's feeding off our fear." Julian nodded, his mind working furiously. The creature, whatever it was, didn't just want them dead, it wanted something else. Something deeper. He had realized that the beast's actions weren't random. They were methodical. The way it circled the ship, the way it tested the hull, the way it seemed to sense every tremor of fear, they weren't just attacks. It was learning. It was trying to understand them, trying to anticipate their next move. "We can't outrun it," Julian murmured, his voice distant. He turned back to Rourke, his eyes haunted by the realization. "We need to stop it at the source. Whatever it is, it's feeding off the ocean. We need to understand what it's tied to. We have to confront the heart of the deep." The words hung in the air, charged with the gravity of their meaning. The creature had not just appeared by chance. It was part of something greater, a force of nature that had been disturbed, awakened by something they had yet to comprehend. Julian's mind raced with possibilities, trying to connect the dots between the creature, the storm, and the strange events that had led them here. Everything had changed the moment they set sail, the moment they had crossed into uncharted waters. Daniel, still trembling from the last encounter, glanced up. "You're saying we need to go deeper? Into the ocean?" His voice cracked, as if even the idea of facing the depths themselves sent a chill down his spine. Julian shook his head. "Not into the ocean, but into its core, the heart of the deep. We've seen it now. It's part of the water itself, feeding off its life force. We need to destroy whatever's fueling it. If we don't, we'll be swallowed whole by the void." There was a long, suffocating silence. The realization that they had no choice, that their only option was to descend into a place that should not exist, settled over them like a heavy shroud. But they had no time to waste. The creature was already preparing for another attack. Julian could feel the ocean's pulse quickening, like a predator sensing its prey's fear. The waves grew more violent, crashing against the ship's sides with greater intensity. "We need to figure out how to reach it," Julian continued, his eyes scanning the horizon for anything that might offer a clue. He had seen enough to know that they were dealing with something beyond human understanding. The storm, the beast, and even the ship itself had all been pulled into this strange, dark symbiosis. The heart of the deep isn't just a metaphor. It's real, and if we don't stop it, this thing will destroy everything. Rourke stepped forward, his face hardening with determination. "Then we need to find a way to reach it. Now!" He turned to the others. "We fight for survival, or we die waiting for it to take us." The crew rallied around him, the weight of their shared resolve settling like armor over their shoulders. They knew they had little time before the beast made its next move, and they needed to act swiftly. The ship, battered as it was their only means of transportation. But the ship was weakening, the hull groaning under the strain of repeated impacts from the creature's attacks. Julian knew they could not survive another direct hit. He glanced at Daniel, whose eyes were wide with fear, but also a flicker of understanding. "How do we get to the heart?" Daniel asked, his voice almost drowned out by the howling winds. Julian inhaled sharply. "I don't know yet, but we've already seen signs. The water, it's alive. Somehow, the creature controls it, or at least it draws its power from it. If we can find a way to disrupt that connection, we can sever its hold on us." The crew moved quickly to gather supplies. Knowing the journey ahead was dangerous and uncertain, they would need more than just weapons. They needed tools, equipment, and the will to survive. Julian's thoughts turned inward as he prepared for what lay ahead. The creature wasn't just a physical threat. It was a manifestation of something much larger, something that had been waiting for them, watching them. They were no longer just sailors. They were part of something ancient, something far older than human civilization. As the crew began to prepare for their descent into the heart of the deep, Julian took one last look at the horizon. The storm was still raging, the sky painted with violent hues of purple and black. The ocean stretched out before them like an endless chasm, a vast, unknowable void. And at its center, the heart of the deep pulsed with an eerie rhythm, waiting. The next phase of their journey would take them into the very heart of the ocean's mystery. And what they would find there, Julian could not yet say. But one thing was certain. There was no turning back. They had crossed the threshold. Now, they had to confront whatever lay ahead. As the crew descended deeper into the heart of the deep, the weight of the ocean seemed to press in on them from all sides. The storm, though still relentless, had lost some of its fury as they approached the source of the creature's power. The ship groaned beneath them, its timbers creaking under the strain of its final voyage. The air was thick with salt and fear, but there was also an unspoken sense of determination among the crew. They had come this far, and there was no turning back. Julian stood at the helm, his mind sharp and focused, but his body weary from days of constant strain. The creature's attacks had not ceased, though they had learned to anticipate its movements, staying one step ahead. But they knew this final descent would be different. This was the heart of the ocean, the place where the ancient forces that controlled life and death resided. It was a realm of pure energy, untouchable and indifferent to human existence. And yet, here they were, attempting to unravel its mysteries, to wrest control from a power far beyond their understanding. The crew had rigged up a series of makeshift diving suits, constructed from whatever materials they could salvage, and now they were preparing for the final plunge into the unknown depths. There was no telling what they would find below the surface. But as the ship sank lower, as the darkened waters enveloped them, Julian felt a strange calmness wash over him. It was as if the ocean itself was accepting their presence, acknowledging their will to confront it. It was not the calm of safety, but the calm before the storm, the stillness before the final test. "Are you ready?" Rourke's voice broke through Julian's thoughts, bringing him back to the present moment. Julian turned to face him. The man's face was set in grim determination, his eyes reflecting the same weary resolve that Julian felt. "As ready as I'll ever be," Julian replied, his voice steady. "Once we get to the heart, we don't know what we'll find. But we can't turn back now." Rourke nodded, and the two men moved toward the diving platform, where the rest of the crew was already gathered. They were all silent, each lost in their thoughts, preparing for whatever was to come. The deep, dark abyss stretched out before them, the only sound the distant lapping of waves against the hull. The ship had reached its final descent, and there was no going back. As Julian stepped into the diving suit and descended into the water, he felt a strange sensation, as if the ocean itself was alive, pulsing with energy. It wasn't just a creature that controlled this realm. It was something much more ancient, much more powerful. The water was thick, as if it were a living entity, its weight pressing against Julian's chest with every breath he took. The pressure mounted as he sank lower, the light from the surface fading, leaving only the inky blackness of the deep. The others followed, their suits glowing faintly in the darkness as they made their way down. The pressure was unbearable, the crushing weight of the ocean threatening to crush them. But they pressed on, driven by a shared purpose. They had come here to confront the heart of the deep, to confront the very source of the creature's power. And as they neared their destination, Julian felt a shift in the water, a subtle current that was almost imperceptible but undeniable. It was as if something was calling to them, pulling them forward, deeper still. The heart of the deep was unlike anything Julian had ever imagined. It was a vast, otherworldly cavern, filled with pulsating energy, an ethereal light that radiated from an unknown source. At the center of it all was the creature, no longer the form they had seen circling the ship, but something much larger, much more terrifying. It was a being of pure energy, its body shifting and warping as if it were made of liquid darkness itself, its eyes glowing with a malevolent intelligence. And it was waiting for them. Julian's heart raced, but he did not hesitate. This was it, the final confrontation. The creature had been feeding off the energy of the ocean, drawing its power from the heart of the deep. And now, they had to stop it, or they would all perish in its wake. He raised his hand, signaling to the others to prepare. They had come this far together, and now it was time to finish what they had started. With a sharp motion, Julian activated the device they had constructed, a crude but powerful mechanism designed to disrupt the energy flow of the creature. The creature's eyes flickered, as if sensing the threat, and for a moment, there was a pause, a stillness in the water. Then all at once the ocean erupted. The water churned and twisted around them, as if the very heart of the deep was alive and resisting their intrusion. The creature howled, its form warping and distorting as it fought back against the device. But Julian and the crew did not falter. They had come too far to turn back now. The device hummed with energy, its pulse matching the beat of the ocean itself. The creature's form began to disintegrate, its body breaking apart into tendrils of pure darkness, evaporating into the water like smoke in the wind. For a moment, the ocean seemed to exhale, the pressure lifting, the tension fading. But even as the creature dissolved, Julian knew this was not the end. The heart of the deep was still there, still pulsing with energy, still holding its secrets. They had defeated the creature, but the true heart of the ocean remained untouched, its mysteries unsolved. Julian looked back at the crew, their faces reflecting the same mixture of relief and awe. They had survived, but they had not conquered the ocean. They had merely scratched the surface of its power, and in doing so, they had unlocked something far more dangerous than they could have ever imagined. The ship ascended slowly, leaving the heart of the deep behind, but Julian knew this was not the end. It was only the beginning. The ocean had been awakened, and its mysteries would continue to haunt them long after they had left its depths. The heart of the deep had given them no answers, only more questions. And the creature, whatever it had been, was only a glimpse of the dark force that lay beneath the surface. The ocean was alive, and it would never be forgotten. As the crew sailed back toward the distant shore, Julian stared out into the horizon, his thoughts a whirlwind of unanswered questions and unspoken fears. The deep had shown them its power, and they had glimpsed a fraction of its truth. But the true terror, the true heart of the deep, was still waiting deep beneath the waves.